to see such a good turnout. So first I want to start by saying, recognizing we're on occupied Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe land, and we're thankful to be here and be welcomed on this land. I think it's important to recognize that. It's a very blood-soaked land. So tonight, after the Canadian Jewish Congress, Palestine, Canadian Jewish politics, and this immense mess with Dan Freeman-Maloy. So this talk is sponsored, as you heard, by the Center for Social Justice, who have passed around these little cards. Does everyone have the one on their seat? So you can feel free to give a donation to the Center for Social Justice, who's generously paid for the room tonight. It's also brought to you by Independent Jewish Voices Toronto, the Socialist Project, and the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, of which I'm a member. I'm also a member of IJV. I'm a member of all the Jewish groups, really, the United Jewish People's Order. I'm not a member of the UJA. I'm part of the Jewish disestablishment. So Dan and I were both at the founding meeting for the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network in the summer of 2008. And IJAN has chapters in the United States. There's a few of us here in the network in Canada. We're in the UK, we're in Israel, 1948, Palestine, Spain, France, and the United Kingdom. We also work on projects like the Stop the JNF campaign. And for instance, last year, the folks in the UK were able to help the Jewish National Fund lose 49% of its funding. So we're hoping that eventually we can do that here in Canada, where they also have charitable status. So why an international Jewish anti-Zionist network? Well, there is a World Zionist Congress, so we figure we need to have ourselves organizing on an international level to stand up to the Zionist bullies and the Zionist violence that they're perpetrating, not just in Palestine and what remains of historic Palestine, but all over the world. In fact, I'll just plug, at the table, we have our latest publication, which is Israel's Worldwide Role in Repression. It talks about Israel's arms exports, their pacification industry, and also their role in exporting their violent techniques that get demonstrated in places like Gaza, the West Bank, and within 1948 Palestine. So tonight, Dan is going to talk to you about the fall of the Canadian Jewish Congress, and now we have the Canadian Jewish News, which is also going to cease its publication, and he's going to talk about the politics connected with that and what that means for those of us who are on the left, and the rise of these kinds of groups like CJA, is it the Center or the Committee now, for Israel Jewish Advocacy. They've changed they've meant one thing at one point and then they changed their name. And they're a very powerful top-down organization, and they've taken over what is Jewish. And that's another reason for groups like IJAN to exist, to say that Zionism doesn't define us. We're diverse, we come from diverse communities, locations, and politics, and histories. And we've always been around, and so we want to bring that history back. But I'll leave you with one last thought. The most important thing I think that we have to do as an organization is to break down that need for a Jewish voice to talk about Palestine. Because what's going on in Palestine is terrible, it's a war crime, it's genocide, and anyone who has a conscience and integrity and wants justice in the world should be able to stand up and speak to that. You shouldn't have to be Jewish. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan. And thanks very much for...
Thanks. So, things in Canadian politics have really been, in recent years, deteriorating on quite a number of fronts. We could sort of go issue by issue, but there are quite a number of crises that we need to deal with in terms of both what's happening domestically and the role of the Canadian state internationally. And really one of the pieces of this that does stand out is the destructive role that Canadian policy is playing with respect to Palestine. Whatever one thinks of the General Assembly votes at last autumn's General Assembly concerning Palestinian statehood, what we did see at the General Assembly was the sort of loss of US control over the pace of diplomacy on Palestine that is quite healthy. The US sort of pattern of blocking any diplomatic initiative out of its control is one of the real stumbling blocks to any resolution of this. And that moment was significant, and it's quite significant just how isolated Canada was in opposing Palestinian statehood with really a small cluster of Israeli allies. The Australians even managed to have the sort of domestic challenge to their government that blocked a vote against Palestinian statehood at the level of sort of, again, the Australian Labour government, which has been quite extreme in its pro-Israel positions. And it really speaks to how bad things have gotten in Canada, that, again, we saw that sort of Canadian isolation, and not much in terms of the cost that the government's paid for it. So any decent movements that emerge in this country and try to deal with the sort of range of political crises we're facing are going to need to deal in a principled way with the question of Palestine. And one of the realities that I think we need to sort of just face in the coming years is that those movements, in as much as they deal in a principled way with the question of Palestine, are quite likely to be sort of smeared as anti-Semitic, either directly or by implication. And this is a sort of reality that extends far beyond the statements or the influence of Canadian Jewish organizations. You have, in the West, no longer the sort of weapon of anti-communism with which to beat at the left. Anti-terrorism goes so far, but especially for liberal audiences, there is a real sting to being called anti-Semitic, and it's with sort of comfortable ease and convenience that you have the likes of Jason Kenney telling us in recent years that actually the left are the purveyors of anti-Semitism, and then trying to sort of use that smear for obvious political purposes. So this extends beyond Canadian Jewish politics, but in Canada, as in much of the West, the Canadian Jewish establishment and the mainstream Canadian Jewish communal leadership are pretty eager partners in this fiasco. And most of what I'm going to try to do today is explain why I think we should try to ignore them, expect the sort of smears from them that are likely, and if we're forced to pay attention to them, do so quite critically. I also want to emphasize before proceeding that we need to be careful about how heavily we rely in doing this on specifically Jewish dissident organizations. It's an important sort of strategic position for the organized Jewish dissident left to occupy, but we also have to be, I think, quite careful. It's not incumbent on leftists to either produce or point to a specifically Jewish organized alternative to the mainstream communal leadership as a precondition for dealing in a principled way with the question of Palestine. Doing so is, again, a basic matter of principle, and we can maybe talk about it more in discussion, but I think we have to be careful in thinking through our strategies in doing so. As for what I'm again going to talk about, though, for most of my time, first I'm going to just, by way of general historical background, try to give a sense of where Western Zionism just fits in terms of the Zionist project and the colonization of Palestine and where it fit historically. And in terms of how this is thought about in Canada and elsewhere, highlight how effectively racist it is that the effect of these organizations on Palestinians has been kind of written out of this history. Having done that, I'm then going to just sort of, trying to be both thorough and tolerably brief, go through the evolution of the organizations that sort of make up the Canadian Jewish communal mainstream, which, when I'm talking about sort of those we should ignore and should expect opposition from, I'm referring to. So, in terms of where Western Zionism fits, technically the political Zionist movement, which was launched in the late 19th century and sort of crystallized around the colonization of Palestine, was supposed to be a national movement, so claimed its leadership, for all Jews, right? But practically, even by their organizational standards, it was a little more complicated than that. For Jews in Europe facing crisis, westward migration to the United States was a much more attractive prospect when it was open to people. And for people, say, who were in the United States and Jewish, even those supportive of Zionism were not going to allow themselves to be uprooted from places like the United States, right? And the same applies to Canada. Hannah Arendt made the point in describing these politics that those who joined the Zionist organizations of the West were those who, in much of Europe, would have made up what was called who would have been found in Europe in the so-called pro-Palestine committees. The committees organized by the people who were, in a pretty decent and well-established position and who saw it as a philanthropic enterprise, certainly not something that would uproot them from their position in certainly North America, but also Western Europe. So I think when we're looking at the role of the Zionist movement in places like Canada, it's pretty inseparable from the not simply sort of recruiting of Jews to settle in Palestine, which really wasn't what was going on, so much as part of trying to get Western sponsorship for the Zionist enterprise. The establishment of a Jewish state was going to take, in the eyes of those trying to carry it out, external support to have the force to impose it by the force of arms, which was effectively the strategy, on the native population. And in trying to get that external support, the Zionist leadership looked to the West. So what you had in pretty much all the Western countries where Zionism became a significant force were efforts to make Zionist and patriotic identification compatible. And I'm not going to go through what that meant everywhere, but the Zionist enterprise essentially got its first real boost in 1917 with the issuance of the Balfour Declaration by Britain, saying that the British Empire viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And thereafter, within Britain and within the sort of British white dominions, it was really a sort of patriotic thing to do to support the Zionist enterprise, and that's how it was framed by the leadership. So when you look, say, in the early 20th century, but after the First World War, to Canadian Zionism and what that meant, and the history that they discuss, you're really looking, especially at the level of leadership, and here I'm talking about the Canadian Zionist movement, about an Anglophile fundraising politics, right? In a position of patriotic identification with the British Empire, we will provide, not the settlers so much as the funds for colonization in Palestine. And in terms of how this is written, this is a history that has not been subjected to the most basic scrutiny based on what Zionist colonization has meant practically in Palestine. Gabriel Peterberg, who's an interesting Israeli expat intellectual writing from the US West Coast, described sort of the effectively racist strain in even liberal Israeli politics, and said one of the issues, and he says this for settler societies in general, was whether or not the presence of indigenous people is consequential to how settler societies were shaped. This is the issue that exposes the exclusionary or segregationist nature of white liberalism, and perhaps multiculturalism as well. The more liberal versions of hegemonic settler narratives may admit that along the otherwise glorious path to creating a nation, bad things were done to the indigenous people. They may even condemn these bad things and deem them unacceptable. At the same time, these narratives deny the possibility that the removal and dispossession of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of others is an intrinsic part of what settler nations are, right? And I think what we need to do in looking at Canadian Jewish history is not only look at the level of communal organization, at the role of support, say, for colonization of Palestine, but realize that that's something that had impacts on Palestinians that are systematically whitewashed in the literature as it exists. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I'm going to use the case of the work of quite a good historian, Gerald Tolchinsky, in some respects. And not because he's a joke, but because he's sort of one of the best out there as an indication of how far this reaches. Now, Gerald Tolchinsky, again, wrote some of the standard histories of Canadian Jewish politics. And his sort of main two-part history was recently republished by University of Toronto Press. Now, in 2008, right? Now, I don't think it would be too much to ask for, in 2008, a book published by the most prestigious, probably, book publisher in the country, to realize that when you talk about issues of Zionism and association with Israel, there might be, there may be Palestinians that exist. There may be an Israel-Palestine conflict. That this is a reality that might in earlier decades have been easier to deny, but this is not maybe asking too much. And what we have, though, and one of the main Zionist fundraising projects, again, without going into too much detail, in the 1920s and 1930s, was a major purchase of a tract of land. And this is how Gerald Tulczynski describes it. JNF officials in Jerusalem, especially an official named Menachem Musishkin, approached Canadian Zionist fundraisers and campaigned to have Canada raise $1 million to buy a block of land on the Sharon Plain north of Tel Aviv at Emek Hefer, a large tract of uninhabited sand and swamp. Right? A large tract of uninhabited sand and swamp by one of the better intellectuals of Canadian Jewish politics in a U of T press book, and it's just a total, obvious, flat falsehood. I mean, I wrote about this in 2008, and he's a much better historian than I pretend to be. Were he so inclined, I'm sure he could do it more originally. You look to the main Palestinian analysts of Zionism, Walid Khalidi, Noor Masalha, they've addressed this. This specific case was dealt with in the Hope Simpson report, one of the main reports issued by British colonial authorities. It was dealt with in a focused article by the world's main the main Middle East Studies journal, the International Journal of Middle East Studies. And what in fact was the case was that this triggered the purchase with Canadian funds of territory from which a community of more than 1,000 people was displaced. So, as you had in the late 1920s and 1930s, with sort of Canadian government blessing and public support, Canadian Zionist fundraising for this large tract of uninhabited sand and swamp, its inhabitants were in 1929 issued eviction orders and first resisted the eviction with sticks and stones. By 1933, this became an issue that sort of spilled beyond Palestine, but was a major focus of developing national politics. On this case, the Emek Hefer case, or the Wadi al-Hawarith case, there was a general strike declared in Nablus. The tenants were only prevented from joining demonstrations marking the 1933 anniversary of the Balfour Declaration by British police, including British Air Force, dispersing them. I mean, what you have, though, is just the writing of this out of history. Now, if you take, say, Menachem Musishkin, the JNF official who brokered this deal, he said in 1930, not only for this case, but for Palestine generally, if there are other inhabitants there, they must be transferred to some other place. We must take over the land. We have a greater and nobler ideal than preserving several hundred thousands of fellahin, of Palestinian peasants. The British Assistant District Commissioner in Nablus explained that this pocket of primitive semi-Negroid Bedouin is a nuisance and only serves to impede the proper development of a very valuable area. Now, Tulczynski doesn't have to stoop to the level of direct disparagement because there's just not an acknowledgement that any of this exists. And that's something that you're able to get away with given current Canadian political culture, and I don't think that's only a matter of sort of historical significance. So what we really have is a whole area of Canadian history that has not been subjected to any of the most basic critical scrutiny. Now, as for the general politics of the movement, and I'm going to focus in this early period on the Canadian Zionist movement specifically, although, because there's no way in the context of this talk I'm going to go through the whole of Canadian Jewish politics, right? The point, though, is that these Zionist politics, after the Second World War, came to take over the mainstream communal structures. But, again, it was sort of a minority current, even in a fundraising sense, before the Second World War. And this sort of stretched across political currents. I'm not going to launch into an attack on labor Zionism exactly, but I do think there's a sense in which people look to those early years of labor Zionism and think about JNF blue boxes on tables, not necessarily realizing that this is the sort of fundraising project which was the main one when coins were being dropped in, right? This was a movement fundraising for the principal Zionist organizations at the time, basically the Jewish Agency and the Jewish National Fund. And these were organizations campaigning hard against any form of tenant protection legislation for Palestinians. And yet, in the West, one can sort of have purported sympathies with labor and look in a sympathetic way to this kind of politics. Anyway, the labor Zionist stuff wasn't really what was destined for any leadership. What, as I sort of tried to identify earlier, the Zionist leadership was after in looking to the West was funds. They sought people with funds, and it was people with fundraising that came to dominate Western Zionist organization. So that was sort of the case through to the Second World War. And what happened after the Second World War was you really did have this begin to take over the broader communal organizations. And I want to be clear, when I talk about this sort of politics of, in the early years, Anglophile fundraising for Zionist colonization, but really this Zionist fundraiser-dominated politics. These did come to take over Canadian Jewish communal politics. But I want to distinguish sharply between the communal organizations and sort of Jews writ large. In the 1940s, one of the principal British Zionist leaders, Selig Brodetsky, wrote that they were sort of discussing how they were going to deal with the question of the fact, among other things, that a lot of the British Jewish population was just still quite resistant to Zionism. And what he wrote was, he said, look, we're not going to be able to do it. We're not going to be able to to win over the Jewish population. You take, for example, one of the sort of main historic Jewish centers of working class Jewish life in Britain, East London. You know, it has some resonance in British left lore before the First World War, though the sort of stomping ground for Rudolf Rocker, who was known as the anarchist rabbi. Though he wasn't Jewish at all, he agitated and fought in Yiddish and was very much part of that political milieu. Similarly, this was the backbone of a lot of the anti-fascist organizing in the 30s in Britain. This was a constituency, the working class East End of London, that was never won over to Zionist politics. But that's not, Selig Brodetsky said, the issue. The main issue is, can we make Anglo-Jewry give the impression of being a Zionist Anglo-Jewry? Namely, through taking over the principal communal organizations. In Britain, that meant the Board of Deputies. Symbolically for the West at large, one of the main negotiations happened with the United States. And the probably principal American Jewish elite organization, or the most prestigious one, the American Jewish Committee, had a series of negotiations with the Israeli leadership in sort of the 40s and 50s, producing what's known as the Ben-Gurion-Blaustein exchange between the head of the Israeli state and the American Jewish Committee. And the deal was basically this. The American Jewish Committee said, look, we know ideologically, really you think we don't belong in the US, but you have to shut up about that. That was the position to the Israeli leadership. If you're willing to abandon this nonsense that you have a national claim to the allegiance of American Jews, if you're willing to shut up about the idea of us leaving the United States, then we will offer you political support. And that was sort of the accord that was also understood to encompass Canada and Britain. Organizationally, though, again, especially in these early years, it was funds that the Israeli leadership was after. Until in the 1960s and after the 1967 war, there was a big spike of state funds, particularly from the United States. These organized donations from sections of the Jewish community made up a huge proportion of Israeli sort of revenue for basic state expenditure through the 40s and 50s. So the main financial organizations in this regard, like that had some fundraising muscle in North America, were the federations. So what happened after the Second World War then was Ben-Gurion intervened pretty directly, as it's described in American politics in particular, to shift the leadership of support work for Israel away from the traditional Zionist organizations and towards the federations. Now, these are, without going into the decade-by-decade name changes, what were first known in Toronto as, not first, but post-war, the United Jewish Welfare Fund in Toronto, in Montreal, Allied Jewish Community Services, and these two are the precursors to Toronto's United Jewish Appeal Federation of Greater Toronto and Montreal's Combined Jewish Appeal. Okay? So these federations, it was a big thing for the Israeli leadership to sort of cultivate, and they seem to have done so fairly intentionally, the leadership of these fundraising federations, of these fundraiser-dominated federations. And this is sort of, this kicked off the trend that we've really seen accelerate in more recent years. So I'm going to try to get to the recent years in a moment, but first a little bit more of the sort of decade-to-decade chronology. Again, after the Second World War then, largely at the initiative of the Israeli leadership, you have these federations in the United States, but also in Canada, increase in prominence within communal leadership structures. Okay? And what happens is this sort of sets the trend that intensifies in the 1960s and particularly the 1970s. So in the same way that after the First World War, it was extraordinarily convenient for Canadian Jews to pledge allegiance both to Zionism and to the British Empire, after the 1967 war, the extent of US support for Israel meant that it's a real almost marker of Western alliance patriotism to identify with Israel. And in this context, what you have is you have a couple of trends that are really the two key trends when we're looking at, I think, Canadian Jewish organization today begin to descend on the communal leadership, right? And one is a focus above all else on Israel advocacy and a political orientation towards Israel. And another is the domination of decision-making by people in the community with funds. Now, in terms of the community as a whole, the Jewish community as a whole, it's true, saw real upward class mobility after the Second World War. But any traces of Jewish working class participation in leadership were pretty openly sidelined as these trends took hold. The 1970s then saw the development of the sort of core set of organizations that have in recent years consolidated their hold over Canadian Jewish leadership. On the one hand, you had the federations in Canada, the two main ones certainly being Toronto and Montreal, merge with their US counterparts. So this system in Canada became part of a North American set of organizations. Without going into the decade-by-decade name changes, this is what's now referred to as the Jewish Federations of North America, with their Canadian section, right? You also, again, had the pushing out of any participation in leadership by people in the community without so much money, and a real fundraising domination, a fundraiser-dominated leadership take hold. And you also had a reinvigorated focus on what they call Israel advocacy. There was a formal affiliation struck during this period that lasts, as I understand to this day, between the federation system and the Israeli state, which has status in Israeli law through the Jewish Agency. So these are organizations formally affiliated with the Israeli state. And the principal post-1967 expression of this was less fundraising, because now you have changed circumstances, and more political advocacy, right? And the main vehicle for that was the Canada-Israel Committee. So the Canada-Israel Committee had three parts to it. This is the Canada-Israel Committee. When people talk about the sort of late 20th century Canadian Israel lobby, this is really the main organization. One of them were the Canadian Zionists. So under pressure from Jerusalem, all the Zionist parties were amalgamated into the Canadian Zionist Federation and were one piece of this organization, of the Canada-Israel Committee, but kind of fading in significance. Another piece was B'nai B'rith, which I'm going to set aside for now, and hopefully we can return to in discussion. And the preeminent member, though, was the Canadian Jewish Congress, which historically had a real history of, I mean, whatever else one thinks, broad Jewish participation going back decades. But what you saw, there's all this rhetoric about the Canadian Jewish Congress being a parliament for all of Canada's Jews. It's sort of the Canadian Jewish Parliament is always how it was described, certainly in its own promotional material, but also more generally. But what happened in the 1970s, and pretty definitively then, was the fundraiser-dominated federations that I've described basically took over control. I mean, effectively, that was the institutional fact. So both in Montreal and in Toronto, local federation chapters merged with the local branches of the CJC. And this was a process in the 1970s which Canadian Jewish Congress officials were extraordinarily critical of. When the United Jewish Welfare Fund in 1976 moved to sort of swallow up the Canadian Jewish Congress local section, Congress people blasted it as a welfare fund takeover in disguise. They said it was sure to worsen the situation in which the Ministry of Revenue became the dictator of Parliament. And the retiring CJC Vice President Saul Hayes lamented the narcissism and self-infatuation of the welfare funds. And thereafter, you had this reality, which is that, as they put it, the Ministry of Revenue became the dictator of Parliament. Advocacy, and this wasn't just the Canada-Israel Committee, but the Canadian Jewish Congress, was subordinate to this budgetary leadership made up of the federations. So, what we've seen in the last decade, then, is not a departure from, but a real intensification of these trends that go back decades and decades. Now, we can maybe return in discussion to some of the more nitty-gritty organizational details of the 2000s. But in 2007, one of the main intellectual authorities in Canada on Canadian Jewish politics, a guy named Harold Waller, who teaches at McGill, published a 3-part series of articles for the Canadian Jewish News. Again, this was in spring of 2007, sort of looking back at the history of Canadian Jewish politics and where things stand in organized terms. Waller, again, identified 2 critical trends. One, the increasing focus over the decades on Israel advocacy above all political priorities. And the other, the increasing domination of decision-making by sort of budgetary authorities within the communal structures. And what he explained is this. During the War on Terror years, a period of sort of heightened conflict over Palestine where there was a sense within these advocacy systems that something of an offensive was in order. The traditional budgetary leadership within the community, sort of people affiliated with the federations in particular, were joined by people who hadn't in the past had anything to do with Canadian Jewish politics, but were, by background Jewish and brought a lot of new money to the table. And this new combined establishment began from sort of 2002, but especially from 2004, restructuring everything. And this was the backbone of what became, again, CJA, the Canadian Council for Israel and Jewish Advocacy. And this is sort of like a federation Politburo under which everything was restructured. So the Canadian Zionist Federation and B'nai B'rith were booted out of the Canada-Israel Committee, and the Canada-Israel Committee was restructured. The Canadian Jewish Congress was put under tightened federation control. Tons of money was poured into combating anti-war movements on campus through a set of different organizations. And it's sort of this intensification of pre-existing trends that we've seen since. So, really, I mean, we have reason on principle to disagree with this, but even people who are paying attention, who are quite ideologically Zionist, have been a little horrified. And you take Michael Brown, right? Michael Brown is as one of the leading intellectual stalwarts over the decades of the Canadian Zionist scene proper. Like a principled and ideological Zionist. Not principles or ideology we would agree with by any stretch, an affiliate of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. But after the spring 2007 articles that Waller published in the Canadian Jewish News, in the summer of 2007, there was a new round of sort of tightened subordination of the Canadian Jewish Congress to the federations. And at that point, Michael Brown wrote, again in the Canadian Jewish News, "The last vestige of Canadian Jewish communal democracy is about to die," describing this as the final step in the move from democracy to paternalistic plutocracy. This was, again, how this long-time committed Zionist described the evolution of the Canadian Jewish communal mainstream in recent years. And since 2007, this has just continued. So in the summer of 2010, the federations, whoever eliminated it, Quebec Jewish Congress elections were eliminated. As of summer 2010, there were no more elections for the Quebec Jewish Congress, And in the summer of 2011, the final step was taken, and they just dissolved Canadian Jewish Congress altogether, right? So I guess the main point I'm wanting to make, all in all, is fairly simple. These are organizations which are going to reflect the politics that you would expect them to, right? This is a North American corporate advocacy system formally affiliated with the Israeli state and reflecting the politics of hawkish sections of the Canadian Anglo establishment. The sad reality is they've hijacked and taken over the principal historic centerpiece of Canadian Jewish communal organization, but in the process they've also really hollowed it out. And I think on the one hand we're very likely to encounter smears from these organizations in the years ahead, but I really think that people don't need to do too much flinching in the face of that, given just how predictable that is, given their organizational makeup. Maybe before moving to discussion, a note just on the effect these organizations have had. And I think it's a complicated question. The deterioration of Canadian politics on Palestine in recent years links with much broader international and Canadian political trends, right? Briefly, since the late Cold War, really, the United States was working to find new ways of reestablishing the sort of hub and spokes alliance that had allowed for it to dominate the West and international affairs in the early post-war period. Through the war on terror, you've had a real push to bring Western allies into line on foreign policy initiatives throughout the Third World, right? So you see in the case of Canada, this move where after limits emerged in Canadian participation in the Iraq War in 2003, through the Third World, you have a pretty eager incorporation by the Canadian foreign policy establishment in US interventions. You see participation with the US and the French in the overthrow of the elected government in Haiti. You see escalated combat operations in Afghanistan. And you also see a real push by the United States to entrench its control over Western diplomacy on Palestine through all sorts of mechanisms we can discuss. And during these years, as the US is doing things like sending John Bolton to stampede around in the UN and reverse anti-Israel voting trends, Canada becomes increasingly supportive at the UN of Israel, right? Now, CIJA certainly during this period was escalating its advocacy and lobbying activities, and also certainly its CEO claimed credit for a lot of the liberal voting changes at the UN. I think we have to take some of that with a grain of salt. They were kind of pushing an open door. I think they had an encouraging effect, but they pushed the door a little further open. But they were really moving with the direction of Canadian politics at the time. The issue, I think, isn't so much that this is a set of organizations that's corrupting an otherwise benign foreign policy. The issue is that they are worsening it. And in addition, they're a grand pain for anyone wanting to build a challenge to the policies that exist. In the press, on the campuses, through the society, anti-war and Palestine solidarity movements face opposition from them. And they poured money into the campuses. I'm sure people have almost direct experience with sort of some of the momentum that they helped to bring to bear for rightist organizing on campuses. So we should expect, based on their organizational makeup, a politics that are going to put them against us for the foreseeable future. These are organizations that should be viewed as adversaries, but I think given the way in which they're even by many of their allies' standards, hollowing out the organizations and making them into a shell of what they once were, I don't think that should be reason for people to flinch. So I guess that's...